bio readings I find strange. So I've rewritten all the ones that I was given. But this has been a long day, so I've rewrote them to be shorter. So without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Mira Henry, who is the co-principal of the Los Angeles-based collaborative Current Interests and is a member of the design faculty at SCI-Arc. Mira's design and scholarly work focuses on the intersections of architecture, race, and materiality, and is informed by special attention to color, assembly details, and cultural criticism. She is the recipient of the 2019 Architecture League Prize, the Henry Adams Medal, the AIA Award, and the Archiprix International Gold Medal. So please welcome Mira.
Okay. Thank you, Ashley, for having me here. I really appreciate it. And I'm feeling a little tired, but I'm gonna do my best. And so it might be my mind will become a bit more sharp as we move through this set of slides. But I do have to say that as a sort of point of reflection, because at this time in this conversation, we've seen a lot. And the things that I find kind of staggering is the amount of kind of deep specificity of each of the work that we've seen, which I actually think is very rare. I think that the people who have presented up until now are kind of producing their work, they're producing their new audiences, they're producing kind of in new environments, because maybe the sort of edges of the discipline could not quite contain them yet. So I really appreciate that. So I'll start. So I titled this Blankets and Other Systems of Comfort and Defense, and I'm gonna kind of exchange the I and the we, rather fluidly and maybe randomly. I as in me, we as in my office, me and Matthew Al, who have an office in LA. So, so the blanket is let's say a material trope in the work that we've been doing for the last couple of years. And so I'll show you some of that. And also, I think I thought about how to participate in the context of this lecture and whether to try and when fit into the topic, like very specifically, do I address fulfillment like as a thing and then try and push my work into that, or like how do you do it? And so I think I just decided I think there's enough sort of affinity. So I'm just gonna talk about some projects, and I think how they particularly relate to ideas of desire, constructions of desire, what that means culturally, and in this case quite kind of locally in a way, like each kind of project for me has a kind of localism, a sort of site in a way. Okay, let's get into it. Oh, this one, sorry. All right, so blankets. So blankets, wow, like on the left we see the JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, Mars rover solar blanket, right? And on the right we see an intimate scene of a person lying in bed under a set of sheets and some blankets, right? So we could say that the blanket, and this is something that I think has emerged out of what was a kind of a naive sort of intro, like, oh, like this, let's try to do it. Like, wow, what a rich kind of topic in a way. So the blanket as a surface, as a sort of tectonic and constructed surface, is kind of spans like very, very kind of wide kind of aesthetic fields, spatial fields, scalar fields, relationships to technology. Right on the left, we see somebody like overly lit in like too many clothes, kind of probing and doing a sort of technical act. And in the right, in the dark, no clothes on, and in a sort of like deep intimacy. So the blanket, does a lot of things. So I decided rather than like try and like produce a sort of images that like excessive set of images, I decided to start writing some of those things down. So solar blankets, insulation blankets, sound blankets, and I think of these as like a list that would maybe then turn into a loop, moving potentially, although this is not really that well calibrated, kind of potentially from the most kind of technical to the most qualitative, like the quantitative to the qualitative, as it comes with regards to the blanket. So solar blanket, insulation blanket, sound blankets, packing blankets, retention blankets, lead blankets, security blankets, anxiety blankets, electric blankets, homeless blankets, wet blankets. What a blanket. Quilted blankets, woven blankets, felted blankets, baby blankets, accent blankets, car blankets, beach blankets, lightweight blankets, heavy blankets, nappy blankets, messy blankets, cozy blankets, sexy blankets, and then to return back to the top, right? So like kind of this one thing that can maybe produce such a kind of wide degree of kind of mixed feelings. To kind of put it in a slightly finer point, I'm going to talk about a couple of blanket systems that are kind of loom really quite large in my mind. The first being, I'm going to do this, I think I'm going to do this note-free because I don't know how to coordinate all this action. Let me see here. Well, no, okay, so here's, this is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, many of you probably are, but the Quilts of Gee's Bend, which is a set of quilts that were, and a sort of a whole culture around quilt making in a really remote hamlet of Alabama. And these are some images, on the top images from 1937, where in this case, it's kind of first contact to otherwise very remote, like first white contact to otherwise very remote black community, and kind of process of photographing the intimate spaces of the interior, a woman's space, a space that's in some ways defined through material constructions that are, I don't know, not usually discussed, let's say, within the context of architecture. And then on the bottom, these are some of the family members of the same community. In 2015, they won an NEA Heritage Award. The blankets are the quilts are incredible. If you don't already know them, what's interesting about this particular zone of Gee's Bend is that it was so remote because it was sort of at this hook of a river that it actually made it a place where it was a very kind of a safe haven during the kind of mid-19th century, 20th century, during like time of like extreme lynching. So this was actually a place of kind of privacy and safety, and a place where a kind of a really rich kind of cultural and material heritage was able to flourish in the rural South. They also were discovered by a collector named William Arnett, who in the 1960s and 70s, and then kind of began to collect and then curate their work. And in 2002, there was an exhibition at Whitney of the work. So the work is now kind of entered into the kind of national, international cycle of kind of understood as kind of as a sort of a kind of art production, art object. And the other kind of blanket, right, which is maybe the one that we're more familiar with, in this case, the sort of woven one, coming from Semper, 19th century German architect. And of course, he was kind of known for establishing this idea of cladding, the relationship between architectural cladding and kind of an analogy between cladding and like the garment and skin, and this diagram of the Caribbean, the Kerry hut, in which case the infill panel was kind of understood as, in his 4 elements of architecture, as to be a kind of primary component in architecture. And I would say that as a kind of a caveat, or a sort of qualifying statement, I would say that I find this, I return to Semper, but I do so with a certain amount of strain, because I think that I see the Semper's theories as tremendously helpful, but also problematic in the sense that it kind of represents a sort of very specific colonial gaze, and in that sense already entangles in my mind the idea of how they say the idea of cladding, and maybe if we can extend it to this idea of the woven textile into the architectural discourse through a sort of problematics that do relate to sort of race and colonialism. And I think maybe that's also why I kind of do return to Semper, as also a way of allowing that reference to become qualified. This is an example of a project I did about a year and a half ago at SciArc. I called it Rough Coat, and it was imagined to be a facade scale blanket. So you see two beds, one in the foreground, one in the background, and then basically an 18-foot by 18-foot quilt that was draped over a frame. And I was working on developing this material system that combined qualities of the exterior cladding and then pliability and the pliability of an interior component. So it's really trying to push two systems that otherwise wouldn't really want to go together as a way of I think kind of one, fulfilling a sort of deep desire that I had, but also trying to figure out kind of slightly new aesthetic territory and categories of things that looked particularly kind of comfy, but also were kind of strange in their tactility. This was something that was, I used upholstery techniques, so sewing and quilting, and working on a thick open cell foam. So, and then spraying it out with elastomeric paints and stucco. So, which is to say, surface materials that will allow you to then, that are pliable. So elastomeric stucco, you can basically you can see here is, you know, it's a commodity that people buy and use for their homes. It's particularly in kind of areas where there's a lot of earthquakes, in order for there not to get a lot of cracking on their houses. I decided to use that in a way, that kind of an extreme condition, how to bring together the sort of ideas of the exterior with the idea of the interior. Of course, the facade, right, is, I'm going to kind of go back to this, but is a system in architecture which is kind of ruled by kind of performance and stability, and is typically at a very large scale, whereas the blanket is an interior accessory associated with comfort, intimacy, and relationships to the skin. So what would happen if we put those two things together? At the time that I was doing this work, I had was kind of involved in a kind of ongoing collection of houses. I've collecting houses, whatever that really means, taking pictures of houses that I kind of love very, very much. These are in a particular neighborhood, and it happens to be where I live. And I think that that's important, just that one sets up a sort of place of thought, and either that's because it's the books you're reading constantly, or the websites you're on all the time, or just the things that are right in front of you. And that even to say that that's a place to begin felt, at least for me in 2017, where I started this work, or 16 actually, 2016, felt to me to be a sort of active agency, where I had otherwise felt to engage on my own terms would require, my own terms in the kind of architectural discourse, so to speak, would require rules that were not my own. And so for me to just say, I'm just going to take some pictures of the things that are right here, was a way for me to start to find my own voice and my own, through trying to kind of think carefully about what I'm looking at and what I'm seeing. But these houses begin to develop a catalog of what I would describe as an aesthetics of privacy. So layers and layers of material systems that sit in a very narrow field and around the facade. So we see hedges, awnings, eaves, exterior shutters, interior shutters, bars, gates, grates, window tintings, blinds, drapery. All of these layers start to build up and commingle. And part of what I like about the survey is certainly this kind of formal effects, because I'm quite interested in redundancy, thickening of surfaces, and layering, but also the questions of causality that it raises in my mind, which is there's, like, say, one reason why these houses are all like this, but sort of confluence of many environmental and cultural conditions. So there's a sort of legacy of, in all these homes. These homes are mostly built in the 30s and 50s during a sort of boom in the LA flats. This is in area just south of the 10, called Lamert Park. But there's sort of a legacy in terms of, particularly in terms of the landscaping in the 1950s, of like how to aesthetically fit in. So I think there's a sort of cookie cutter quality to these. And yet at the same time, the sort of excessive cladding and shielding is also kind of based off of the fact that it's very hot in LA, right? We need to like cool it down. And then there's this sort of reality of a kind of a hot political climate, an environmental political climate, right? We're in South LA here, which is adjacent and quite literally in the center of a lot of the LA riots. The Watts riots of '65, Rodney King's riots of '92. So like houses begin in my mind, and in this sort of like speculative story that I start to build up and tell and project on these artifacts, on these urban artifacts, like the sort of story of how these things got this way, right? But these are not plans. These are not something that was designed first and then it was not just something that was, say, designed and someone bought the home. These are acts that happen after one purchases a home, and over time, multiple people. Imagine families are owning these houses, and these things are sort of literally a sort of legacy and buildup of the hands of the subjects, the hands of and the material labors of maintenance that take place and become in some ways sensed and aestheticized along the facade of the building. And for me, to this idea of being able to try and sense a vocabulary that is emergent and maybe speaks to subjectivities is really exciting. I think about, there's a text that a good friend of mine, Kati Barkin, who I share a studio with, shared with me. We talk a lot about these topics, her through, both of us through sort of ideas of kind of feminist theory, race and feminist theory. And she showed me this text that I never read by Bell Hooks called Home Place, A Site of Resistance, which Bell Hooks, who I think you all know, talks about the interior of the home as a sacred space for the construction of the self, particularly for Black women and women of color, where the exterior is considered hostile, that the interior could be a place of resistance. In this case, within the context of, let's say, white supremacy, which is kind of underpins American culture, in that case, we have privacy becomes even that much more potent, right? That privacy is critical, and then privacy also, look at all the style that it then can engender, right? Look at all the style of these homes, right? That is something also that I'm quite interested in, right? The particular color combinations, the particular shaping of the shrubbery. So going back to this sort of painting by Kerry James Marshall, Kerry James Marshall is I think he's talked a little bit about kind of patron saints. I'm not Catholic, but nonetheless, some sort of kind of totem or in one's mind, something that kind of holds you. I think that for me, Kerry James Marshall as a painter does that in the way that he builds up color and is able to manage things in the dark, way that he's able to make visible things that are often not visible, and the way that he piles color onto one another. So in the case of Kerry James Marshall, very famous for the sort of paintings that are like color paint by numbers, which is to say that painting is not about color mixing, but color stacking. I find this very interesting, particularly from the context of architecture, specification, and how we can engage in kind of a painterly act in the act of architecture. And on the left, so on the right, we see this beautiful painting again. On the left, a particular house. And I think that this was the sort of, when I was thinking about how to manage these sort of things in my mind, when I was entering into the gallery space for Rough Coat, I began to think about how do I move this stuff to an interior? How do you take the sort of exterior and all this sort of difficult, shaggy, wacky, color-baked, kind of culturally ambiguous kind of character of an exterior and bring it into the intimacy of an interior? And so for Sire Gallery, it was about kind of re-inscribing a sort of interior in the gallery, which is typically a white box, through sort of very, very dark painted black-brown paint and some very kind of particular lighting in order to bring the piece in this case, this quilted facade blanket thing that I made. And I have to say that it was one of those things where, so you can understand the sort of the semiotic of upholstery and semiotics of things that are really soft being combined with, whatever, stucco, which is weird. But one of the things that was quite challenging was when I first brought the piece in, even after I had kind of painted the room and brought the piece in. And Sire Gallery is kind of, it's within the context of the institution, it's kind of like this, kind of like a big deal. People like really care about what happens in that gallery. And I brought the piece in, and it looked horrible, like horrible. Like I felt so pissed. And then I realized I just needed to turn the lights off because like it was way too bright. Like the lights were like a stadium lighting. And so how do you turn the lights down? And I was able to see it. And I think about that as I think about how to render something in the dark, how to move something into the heat, from the heat into an interior. Requires a lot of choreography, architectural choreography. Let's see here. And in this case, lighting was one of them. I have to say one other thing before, which is that this project was done with students, and it was done in a way where, part of the history of the Sire Gallery is that it was originally like a workshop, kind of imagined as a sort of workshop opportunity that kind of was no longer really as central to the kind of way people kind of work on it. They often kind of bring just like their like hardcore team of office people who know how to do their thing, and they build the thing. But I was really wanted to attempt to do it a little more old school and like bring in the students together, set up a sort of series of questions. At the beginning of the summer, wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, other than I knew that I wanted a monumental blanket and I wanted to work with this kind of material. We didn't know we were going to be sewing yet. We didn't know a lot of things when we started working, but one of the things I really liked about working with things that what I would describe had difficult tolerances, right? Tolerances that don't behave the way you expect. Working with a material that doesn't cooperate the way you expect, was that it actually produced a great deal of collectivity, because we all had to come together. And this is not meant to be kind of saccharine, like, oh, we designed it together, but I had total authority, but nonetheless, it was not something, because there was a great deal of knowledge that took place as we worked. And it made me think a little bit about like things like the quilting circles and things where, let's say, the performance and the collectivity and the cultures that take place, the stories and the politics that take place in the act of making. And I don't usually talk about that, but I thought it'd be appropriate at this point in the context of this symposium, because it is certainly within the context of takeaways, one of the biggest actually takeaways for me of this piece. But what was interesting about the lighting was that it was able to be very fugitive. The colors were very fugitive in the space. So there were zones because of, as if the color, the integral color and the color-soaked materials in some ways participated with the commingled with the lighting. And so you had like kind of these kind of green zones and then these really warm brown zones. And a sort of relationship in that case to sort of landscape components and like skin-like components that were kind of in the back of my mind as sort of objects that I wanted to try and invoke in the project. So the work is obviously super tactile, and it's about a sort of tactility. But it also became about kind of the pleasure and the action in space. So I had a photographer come in, and while a group of us just like played around in the space for a day, and sort of imagine like what it would mean to have kind of total agency over your facade, you know. So there was kind of like effortful responses and playful responses, and fictive responses. And really kind of intimate, sweet responses that came out of that sort of kind of performance of the piece in terms of how we represented it. Another project I'll show, I'm just going to show two projects, as a project called Silver House Studio. This is a project under construction right now. And it sort of pairs in a way with rough coat. I mean, a lot of the components, and indeed the kind of question of the blanket, the sort of pliable surface, and then also the layers that take place maybe at a different time point, a different time span than architecture proper, right? There may be a way in which one kind of builds a building, and then there's things that wouldn't necessarily take place after the fact, on the outside, on the inside. I think some of those things were kind of coming up for us. This is a studio, a house and a studio. So this is an artist in Echo Park. On the left is the Silver House, which is the house in the back of his property. It's a hillside. And he's painted the house car paint primer silver, which is amazing. And it had this really amazing sort of ability to reflect. And then he put plywood over his windows, which funny, even though we'd already sort of been like talking about like aesthetics of privacy, blah, blah, blah. The first time I saw it, I didn't even make the kind of connection like, oh shit, like this is exactly very quite powerful to actually say like this is the primary window of my house. They live on the other side in some ways of their house, but there was something very particular to the way that he lived and his family lived, that they wanted this sort of only moment in which the city could maybe see in to be completely blocked out. Not so much blocked out with a blind on the interior, but actually like straight up like on the exterior with plywood and then painted silver and beautifully trimmed with red. So that house sits in the back of the lot, and in the front of the lot is this shaggy studio garage space covered in vines, and he asked us to renovate the front structure. So just again, the sort of, excuse me, the aesthetics of privacy, in this case, window tinting, that we've been looking at. So this is window tinting, not integral to the glass, but something that's applied much like you would do for souping up a car. Is a pretty typical condition, although happens really in the background. Maybe you wouldn't see it that much, but we've begun to start to catalog and track different foils and tintings that get placed on windows. I think it's badass. I think it's really gorgeous. Like, I see this house as having what I would consider a lot of swag, a lot of style. I met the woman who lives there. She wanted to paint the house purple and purple trim and three color purple trims because she liked the color purple. So I don't know if you know the work of Martine Sims. Martine Sims is an artist, but she did a whole piece called The Color Purple. Just to utter the words color purple is to also invoke Alice Walker. There's a sort of kind of cultural, let's say, I don't know, overlap, a sort of that happened for me in seeing this house. On the right is a house that I took a picture of from across the street. It's completely covered in bushes. You can kind of see the top of the house from the beyond. It's hard to understand scale because the context of the landscape is so huge, relatively speaking. So these were these are already kind of touch points in the kind of formal vocabulary in our office. So to come to this was kind of like, okay. All right, let's do it. So on the left is a photograph of the renovation, the model of the idea of the project that we proposed. I actually presented this when I was at the Architectural League in June, and it was knowing what we know about construction. The hedge wouldn't have probably not have been able to be saved anyways. But the client wasn't interested in saving the hedge. It'd probably grow back later, so we didn't have to necessarily render it exactly, but wanted to kind of produce a kind of analogy, a sort of material analogy with a sort of heavy, shaggy, clad, shingled roof, which you see here. And this is a system that we were detailing that's corrugated concrete panels, which we dyed and then dipped, and we'll show you some full-scale models of those. Sorry. But one of the things that was interesting in taking these these pictures of the Silver House studio was that it was very, very hard to photograph. The photography, it sort of resisted a sort of image simply because it was so bright and light in the back. You know, silver is notoriously difficult, metallics notoriously difficult to capture in imagery, and then the darkness in the foreground, so deep and so nuanced. So to hold those things in a single image, it had to be highly constructed. And I think for us, that was helpful because it helped us also situate, not only we understood a sort of material interest in the project, but also a sort of larger kind of cultural questions of the project of what it means to image, particularly at a time when image production is in some ways the new normal in the way that we think about kind of architectural values. The things that we were producing actually resisted a sort of imaging, and that was interesting to us. It also speaks to kind of a history of photography and the biases of photography, biases of Kodak film, and Shirley cards, things that where the kind of film itself historically was always calibrated to capture more nuanced tones of white, and not darks. It wasn't until Kodak Gold, it was a furniture company, a mahogany furniture company, so that you can't capture the brown of our mahogany furniture, and so Kodak changed its chemistry, and then Hershey chocolate was also very happy about that. This is an image of the blacks. We have a black that's red and a black that's green, and then a black that's green in the bottom is then dipped in another black. And this is the other side, the smooth side of the building. And you can sort of see the through those little punched windows, a sort of droopy window detail, and then beyond some more particularity. In this case, the sort of blanket returns the silver blanket, a sort of homage to the silver house, which is behind it. And this was imagined to be a structure that would flop over a frame, a steel frame that would be installed. Because of the budget, it ends up not being able to be steel. It's a wood construction, but I'll show you a sort of a detail that we've been working out in order to manage the sort of our aesthetic interests, given the fact that we can't actually make it out of steel. And then here on top of that is the, layered on top of that is the steel purlin frame, which would then get loaded up with the concrete shingles. All of that is to say that what is not there is the unreinforced masonry walls that is the existing condition, none of which we could really touch or structure anything on anyway because it's unreinforced masonry, so it sucks. This is on the interior of the model, looking back on the right interior of the model, looking back at the silver house. And so you see a sort of analogous relationship between the banding, quilting, sort of the sort of upholstery of the interior beginning to commingle with the back kind of elevation. Another interior of the studio, this case on the kind of mezzanine level that the client wanted for him to have his sort of dry studio up there and then dirty, wet studio down below. And it was imagined that the blanket is in some ways like highly operable, right? The blanket does all of these things. It's an insulation blanket, it's a sound blanket, and it also is a sort of blind system. So you can sort of kind of pull back and bind back the blanket at will, and then shut it down for total privacy, sort of sound privacy as well, sound and kind of heat privacy. I mean, you know, how performative it really is from an environmental standpoint, well, that's a question. I think that we like to entertain that, and it's something that we kick around the studio quite a bit and are actually kind of undergoing some more kind of intense research about what that would mean, to see it as an actual sort of environmental system. I don't think that we believe that that's kind of this only kind of value, though. It is a sort of imagined to be a sort of desirous kind of interior. And then this is the exhibition we did and this fall. We were asked to sort of restage some of our work at a gallery at Princeton. This is the exterior of it, which we painted dark. And then the silver background, silver wall of the silver house, which we had custom painted along the back wall. And a photograph from the exterior looking in, which obviously blows out the front. You can't quite see, is because we wanted to understand how one would see it from the exterior, given all the sort of the relationship of dark to light or dark to bright. And in the daytime, when you're on the interior and you're a bit closer in a part of the space, this is another image. You can see the sort of build-up. So we basically produced a sort of series of one-to-one mock-ups of wall sections of the house or of the studio. So you see the concrete shingles that are hung, and I'll show you. We did what's called a Dryfit, which was very kind of helpful for us because so much of the way that we thought in terms of this, even this like idea of blanketing for us is about something that requires a sort of that expresses a sort of idea about weight. So for us, the Dryfit, which is an entire system which is not mechanically attached. It's only attached through hanging and strapping. So we basically could like pack up everything and then put it back together. So you see the unreinforced masonry kind of slip between what was the purlin frame, which is now also a kind of stand for this thing, and then our metal frame, which is I can tell you a little bit about how that's constructed. In the foreground, though, you see that window, and we did this thing where we're basically like we wanted to do a full-scale cast, a rubber cast of a window gasket, which was insane, and we did. And you can sort of see here that window gasket. It's about a 3-foot window, 2.5 foot by 2.5 foot window, 3-foot window in between that. But what we wanted to do is what we coated was a particular kind of glass it was a bronze glass that was mirror backed, so or mirrored and tinted basically. So you see through it, but depending on the lighting of the day, it becomes a very kind of like much of a mirror and refuses a sort of like visibility on the interior. Ah, really? Well, I'm here, which is the piece that we put into the exhibition, which is some posters that we had printed, and it reads, it's hot in here, draw the shades, turn off the lights. It's hot in here, draw the shades, turn off the lights, which is kind of reminds us of the sort of commingling of the actions of the interior, the actions of the inhabitants, and the kind of material reality of one's kind of built environment. Thanks.